Doctors, lawyers, accountants, engineers, sorry, I got bad news. None of these are middle class. The middle class isn't dying, it is already dead. And here is why. So in this video, I want to bust a myth that I see as very pervasive and harmful to our society. While doing so, I will probably hurt a lot of people's feelings and seriously trigger them. If you're part of the viewers who easily get offended, please leave now. For the rest, prepare to get your eyes open. There have been a lot of discussions about the shrinking and struggling middle class. A lot of these discussions miss the point and try to paint a picture that is far better than the reality. In order to understand why, we first have to answer the question of what the middle class actually is. Traditionally, the middle class is a term that first arose to identify the newly emerging social class of merchants and other small enterprise owners in the towns around the end of feudalism that stood between the working classes, mainly peasants at the time, and the land-owning aristocracy. This is where the term middle comes from. So basically, these were people that controlled limited means of production and were in control of the work they did. For those of you who don't know the term, means of production is any asset that enables the production of goods and services. So for example, a small shoe factory has land that it sits on, the building and the machines inside it. All of these are means of production that enable the workers there to use the machines and produce shoes. This middle class started growing a lot with the advances of technology and the weakening aristocracy, the details of which I'm forced to skip since this is not a history channel. Basically, for a lot of countries in the developed world, being in the middle class became kind of the normal thing to be. And this is one of the reasons why almost everyone I've met, unless they are barely surviving, identify themselves as middle class. It's a kind of default. You've probably seen this in your life too, right? Well, that's very wrong. Here is where I start triggering people. You see, being middle class doesn't mean receiving the average income. It doesn't even mean receiving above average income. It's a big mistake to confuse income with socioeconomic characteristics. As mentioned previously, the middle class are people who have assets, mainly a property to live in, and some degree of control over the means of production from which their income comes. They make independent decisions every day and they bear the responsibility for their decisions instead of doing that for a corporation. So let's go with an example of a supposed typical member of the middle class. Let's look at a well-paid accountant working at a big bank. He makes 3 times the average salary, he has a master's degree in finance, and is a well-respected professional in his field. He has an apartment with a mortgage and saves his salary in a bank account. Do you think this person is middle class? Most people would say yes. The accountant certainly would consider himself middle class. The media would say he is middle class. They might even come up with the stupid idea that he's upper middle class. Is he though? Well, actually, no. Let's assess his situation to understand why. The accountant wakes up at 7 a.m. He curses his alarm, he brushes his teeth, gets in the car, and at 8 a.m. he is in the bank. Walking in the bank, he walks into a building that he has no ownership of. He goes to his desk and starts working on a computer. Does he own the computer? No. He opens his Excel spreadsheet and starts calculating loans, deposits, and all sorts of stuff. Does he have any power over who the bank decides to work with? No. His work is saved to a server that our accountant doesn't even know the location of and he has no control over. He then finishes work and goes back home. His home. Oh wait, or is it the bank's home? 65% of the value of the home is still owed to the bank. He then goes to sleep, resenting the fact that it's only Monday, and he has to go to work tomorrow as well. Because if he doesn't, he will get fired, and the money saved in his bank account will last him and his family only about 8 months. Okay, so our accountant doesn't own the place he lives in. He doesn't decide whether he shows up at work tomorrow. He doesn't decide what he can work on, who he works with, doesn't own any part of his labor, and doesn't decide whether he stays in that position or gets transferred. This basically means that regardless of his high salary, which is, if you remember, 3 times the average for his country, he has zero control over the means of production, doesn't own the place he lives in, and has almost no assets. Bear with me here, I'm not trying to say whether that's good or bad yet, I'm just describing the objective reality. By the very definition of the term, he is not middle class, he is working class. To prove my point, let's compare him with an entry-level construction worker that gets paid minimum wage. He also doesn't own any of the materials he is working with, doesn't decide who his colleagues are, and doesn't own the place he lives in. Obviously, the accountant has a much better life, he has some money saved in the bank, he will pay off his home faster, etc. There's no denying that. But generally speaking, if we zoom out a bit, they are in a very similar position. The accountant has much more in common with the construction worker than with a multi-millionaire who has several businesses and assets like stocks and real estate. This is because if you are in the middle of the spectrum when it comes to income, this doesn't mean you are middle class. This is what everyone confuses. I have even put up this hilarious part of an article from Investopedia about the middle class where they don't even know what it means, so they filled it with disclaimers. Look at this. Middle class families tend to own their home, although with a mortgage, own a car, although with a loan or lease, send their kids to college, although with student loans or scholarships, are saving for retirement, and have enough disposable savings to afford certain luxuries like dining out and vacations. I mean, this is so laughable, I don't even know where to begin. So basically, they don't own anything, they are up to their eyeballs with debt. From time to time, they go out in a restaurant, so they are middle class. What a ridiculous statement. A person who is middle class should have some control and ownership over productive resources. As a bare minimum, they should own their home free of debt. But it doesn't really count in my mind, even as a minimum, because your home is the place where you live. It's a necessity. It's not a productive asset. At least it isn't for you. People who don't own a property don't have zero properties. They have -1 property, because everyone must have a place to live. Alright, now that we've established that the majority of the people are not actually middle class, even if they have above average income, let's see the consequences of that. First, the economic one. A capitalist economy is driven by the mass production of goods and services, which are then consumed by the people in a free market system. The more people consume, logically, the more can be produced, and the circle goes on. Now, since here we talk about economics and not morality, let's forget about whether it's right or wrong to have a few rich people and a lot of poor ones. The fact is that a country that is structured in such a way will simply be less productive and rich. This is because if you are very poor, it is obvious that you don't have money to go on vacations, visit a restaurant, or buy a car. Everyone knows that. The problem that few people realize is that the so-called trickle-down economics doesn't really work. When the super rich get even richer, that doesn't contribute to productive growth. And it's very simple to understand why if you think about it. It's because of something called the marginal propensity to consume. If you are a normal person and you get $1,000 raise in your salary, you will immediately start buying food that is of higher quality. Perhaps you might go to a restaurant once a month, etc., etc. But what happens if you are part of the very wealthy? The moment you get $1,000 more, your life literally doesn't change at all. You don't even notice it. It immediately goes into buying more assets like land, gold, real estate, etc. If you make $10 million a year and you suddenly start making 11 million, there is literally nothing more you can buy. You already have a nice car and you can't drive 2 cars at once. You already have a beautiful house and you can't live in 2 houses at once. You are already eating $500 steaks, and if you eat more, you will throw up. There is nothing more you can consume. And so, in that case, if you don't have a stable middle class that is not worried about the future and drowning in debt, there won't be as much consumption in the economy, which in turn will drive the production and job creation down. Now, the argument people make is that if you give super wealthy people more money, they will create more businesses, factories, etc., and this will create more jobs and drive growth. While that certainly can be the case, it's important to understand that it not always is. One good example is Elon Musk. I mean, give that guy more money and he will probably come up with a crazy innovation that makes all of our lives better. He's already making electric vehicles, trying to put people on other planets, and help develop an artificial neural network that allows disabled people to communicate with the world. This is an example of a productive use of capital, and I mean, God bless him. However, it's not exactly the norm, is it? Think about a painting made 300 years ago costing $50 million, or a piece of property in Monaco overlooking the Mediterranean Sea going from €1 million to 20 million in price. How did that happen? Well, I can tell you. It's a bunch of rich people wondering what to do with their money, outbidding each other in order to play a status game. That piece of canvas and paint that went from $100,000 to $50 million did not create more jobs. It did not lift more people out of poverty or heal some disease. It literally has $50 million of economic value locked in it so that it can stand over some rich person's fireplace so he can brag to his rich buddies, while in the same exact city, there are homeless people on the street. Okay, moving on to the political consequences. A lot of people seem to divorce economics from politics, but they are actually quite connected. A democratic system is doomed without a stable, relatively wealthy, property-owning and independent middle class. The reason for that is when you have a small, wealthy elite controlling most of the means of production and a massive cheap labor force of poor people working for them without any autonomy or property, you can basically throw democracy out of the window. This has been known forever, even by the ancient Greeks. Aristotle says, without a substantial cadre of middle-class citizens who know both how to obey and how to rule, a republic will quickly devolve into a state of war between rich and poor, master and slave. The main reason for that is that with a stable middle class, you have a lot of centers of decision-making. If the majority of the economy is run by a few dozen corporations, their shareholders and CEOs basically make all the decisions, and the rest of us, even if we're highly paid, simply obey them and have nowhere else to go. In a society filled with middle-class citizens, most of who are self-employed or own their small businesses and own their property without debt, none of them is big enough individually in order to influence politics or decide the fortunes of hundreds of workers at the same time. They will have to come up with a democratic system in which they peacefully argue among themselves and decide how the state should be run. If you don't have that, you either have oligarchy, like you have in states like Russia, where there are fake elections, but basically few people decide everything. Or if you have real elections, but a massive population of dependent working class people, you get a lot of populism and resentment within society. Aristotle continues, middle class citizens bring security and stability to the state, for they do not, like the poor, covet their neighbor's goods, nor do others covet theirs, as the poor covet the goods of the rich, and as they neither plot against others, nor are themselves plotted against, they pass through life safely. The idea is that when you have a large population made up of members who own their homes, have no debt, have financial security, and are used to making a lot of micro decisions about their economic life every day, it is the best breeding ground for equality and democracy the way we want it to be. These people are most equipped to make independent decisions, look into the future and plan for it, because they're not worried about paying rent or their credit card debt, and as a consequence, provide the foundation for a functional democracy. If you think I'm wrong, go to places like Russia, South Africa, the big cities in India, etc., and see what the future looks like. Another danger of a lack of prosperous middle class is that a lot of inequality breeds resentment, crime, and ultimately dangerous political movements. An interesting piece of data I came across years ago was where the crime rates in the world are the highest. I mean, in what types of cities. You right now, and also me back in the day, would instantly assume it's the places where there is a lot of poverty, because this is where the slums and ghettos we associate with crime are, right? Well, it turns out the crime rate isn't the biggest in the places which are poor. It is the biggest in the places where there are a lot of poor people and a few rich who basically own everything. Here is what a paper published by the World Economic Forum found out. It says that municipalities in Mexico with lower inequality saw lower rates of crime. The reason for that is actually pretty simple and is rooted in evolutionary psychology. When young men are faced with a situation in which they see a few dudes at the top of the hill living in a mansion while they are barely able to get by, their instinct towards social status gets triggered, but not in a good and productive way, because they see no way out of their situation and they know they're being judged by other men, and most importantly, women, by their financial success. The only choice they have is to become violent in the hopes of changing their situation. So basically what I'm saying is this. If you want peace and prosperity, you should strive to create cities looking like the American suburbs in the 60s and not like modern-day Rio de Janeiro or Johannesburg. And the last but most terrifying effect of inequality is the effects on politics. I have been saying this for a long time, but a democratic system where every person gets one vote, combined with the majority of these people dissatisfied with their lives and with no hopes for the future, is a recipe for disaster, because it is a breeding ground for populism. Picture this. In one country, you have a lot of men in their 30s, owning their house, having no debt, having 2 children, and discussing with their wives to have a third, while at the same time going on 2 vacations per year and knowing they will retire comfortably. At one point, a wannabe dictator runs for president, trying to convince these men to abolish the system and go to war with the neighboring country. What do you think is going to happen? 99% of these men are going to be like, oh, well, you know what? I'm fine the way I am now, I will pass, no thanks. And the populist will be literally laughed out of the elections. Okay, now imagine the same cohort of men cramped in apartments in an urban jungle for which they are in debt for the next 2 decades. They know they will probably never retire because they don't have the money to. They work for a soulless corporation that fires them at will because of a boss they have never seen just because there is a cost-cutting program going on. They can't afford to have kids, and their wife is secretly mad at them and resents them for having to work long hours and not being able to have a child. Now, an opportunistic populist comes and appeals to their lack of self-worth and future prospects by asking them to tear down the system and go to war for him. Do you think they will take the bait? If you don't, let me just remind everyone that a certain German dictator in the 30s, whose name I don't want to mention because I'm not sure how YouTube will treat it, was elected at 30% unemployment rate and crowds of dissatisfied young people. We all know what happened after that. One of the most advanced and civilized societies on the planet turned Europe into hell. Now you might be asking, okay, we got that there's a problem. What do we do about it? And here is where things get tricky, because it depends on what you mean by we. We as society or we as individuals, because these are two very different things and one does not automatically transfer to the other. I'll start with society. If we want to change the trajectory we are on, there are two things that need to be done. The first is we've got to stop the criminal activity of stealing purchasing power from ordinary people through money printing. Every time the central bank creates a new dollar or euro or pound or whatever, the value of the savings in the bank account of my mother and your uncle go down, because the ordinary people mainly work for fixed wages and save money in a bank. At the same time, when that happens, assets like real estate, gold, or stocks go up in value to reflect the newly created money. As a result, the average people are gutted while the very rich get richer. Now, luckily for us in the world we live in, you don't need to own a piece of art or a beachfront property in order to save yourself, because each and one of us can own assets for as little as $50, but more on that a bit later. Still, the vast majority of people are not educated enough to do that, and they get slaughtered through the money printing, falling further and further behind. The second thing we need to do is to vastly increase the taxes on the rich. Here is where I get in trouble for saying that. No, my friend, to you who are watching and has been hustling for a decade, have 2 houses, a small business making $400K a year, and a couple $100,000 in stocks, you are not rich. You are what we should refer to as upper middle class. We should leave you alone, and I'm not talking about taxing you. I'm talking about people who literally make $30 million a year from their assets for just getting out of bed, or who buy $20 million beachfront properties in the same town where there are homeless people. Because if we don't do that, you know what happens? If you ever played the game Monopoly, you should know. The more assets they have, the harder it will be for ordinary people to get out of debt, buy a house, and retire comfortably. Now, because this is more of a personal finance channel and not a political one, although I will do the occasional rant from time to time, as you can see, I'm completely aware that both of the previous solutions are unlikely to happen. So, what are we to do as individuals? Unfortunately, the only path is to work even harder, make money, and invest it properly. You either need to start a business so you can get some leverage, become more independent, and then once the business is stabilized, start investing in assets that can actually put you in the middle class category. Or if you're not the entrepreneurial type, try to get a better job, increase your income from that one, save more money, and again, you need to invest it. Invest it in what is the question? Well, the two most obvious, safe and proven assets are stocks and real estate. The problem with real estate is that it has a high barrier to entry, and besides, if you own your home, you already have big exposure to it. Although, as I said, I would not consider it an asset in your balance sheet. In my opinion, regular investment with your spare money into quality stocks and funds that can slowly grow your wealth and give you passive income is the best way for the ordinary person, and this is why I have a free masterclass that talks about that, which you can check in the description. However, I don't want to sugarcoat things here. This is a tough situation that our society is in. But until the conditions for the solutions on societal level are right, the only thing left is to fight it as individuals for ourselves and our families, and try to increase our wealth by making more money, saving it, and investing it. Keep your heads up high, and have a wonderful rest of your day.